As we entered the 1990s, it became suddenly and urgently clear that a tumultuous change was occurring in America and the rest of the world around us. On every front, love, marriage, and the family, religion and politics and the community, work, leisure, and our global position, the ground beneath our feet began shifting. Yesterday's verities had vanished. Unpredictability and chaos became the norm. You find that a little disturbing? Well, listen to this. In the 1950s and 1960s, there was something much closer to a moral consensus. It was mirrored in a parade of moralizing family TV programs, Ozzie and Harriet, Father Knows Best, Donna Reed and Leave It to Beaver, and even Bonanza. There is absolutely no moral consensus at all in the 1990s. Those disturbing, shocking, frightening words from this book, The Day America Told the Truth. You've heard about this book on major television talk shows. You've seen it heralded in the press. Time, Newsweek, everybody has talked about the day that America told the truth. Peter Kim, one of the authors of this book, is my special guest. He holds a philosophy degree from New York University, Executive Vice President and U.S. Director of Research and Consumer Behavior at the advertising firm J. Walter Thompson. You've done hundreds of interviews, Mr. Kim. Thank you for doing one more, and please tell us, is there any hope for America? This is tragic stuff you're talking about. This is terribly frightening. Are we really that deep in the quicksand of an amoral society?
I think on one level we are. I think the kind of systematic look that we took of really the moral fabric of our society, what we truly believe, the way we organize our day-to-day lives, the kind of ethics we bring to bear as husbands, wives, as children, as workers, as citizens, the more we look at those aspects of our lives, it seems like morality and ethics play very little in our everyday life, play a very little role in our everyday life, and that indeed we are increasingly becoming an amoral society. The fact that I believe more than 90% of us believe that we are often the final arbiter of what is right or wrong, that very few of us today turn to anything beyond our own personal experience or set of values for either moral or ethical guidance, seem to indicate that we are indeed becoming, as you put it, increasingly an amoral society.
Well, it appears to me from reading your book that there's a conundrum here. There's an awful lot of contradictory evidence that came forth between what people in the abstract would like to think about themselves and their country and what they really do, and the chips are down. Are we kidding ourselves? Does this book really say that Americans are two-faced hypocrites?
I think on some level that I think the kind of surveys that have been done of the American population at large have done us a great disservice in a sense that the kind of superficial nature, the kind of questions that have been asked and the way they've been asked have not really painted a true picture of what we are really like as individuals. For instance, I think a recent book assessing, I believe, the last 25 years of surveys done on religion by the Gallup organization basically conclude that the percentage of people in this country who believe in God hasn't really changed. It's still somewhere in the high 90 percentile. However, every aspect of our lives that we look at in the media and the newspaper and so forth seem to indicate that really can't be true. But when you ask people even today, do you believe in God, the chances are 90 or some odd percentage say they do. However, when you probe a little bit deeper than that and ask things like, do you believe in such and such commandment, and do you how often do you frequent church? To what extent does religion play a role in deciding the tough moral issues of our time? The kind of answers you get under these highly anonymous situations that we ask these questions paint a very different picture, to a point where I think only 13% of all Americans today tell us they believe in all 10 commandments, which give you some extent to the degree to which religion doesn't really play a very profound role or even a limited role in our everyday life or influence the kind of ethical choices that we make.
What I found fascinating was this consensus of people who believe in God, who believe in an afterlife, even want to believe in heaven. I think 82% believe in an afterlife, 46% expect to go to heaven, and only 44% expect to go to hell. And yet, when they are quizzed about issues of fidelity and ethics and morals, when they're asked about how they really act on the job, it's amazing. They don't expect either any eternal, temporal, or any kind of punishment. There doesn't seem to be any idea of retribution or justice here in their system. Is that because they feel that we live basically in an unfair, unjust society where the devil gets the hindermost?
Yeah, I think to some extent that's true. I think there's kind of a profound sense of belief that individuals today have the right to make up their own rules as they go along, and that really they don't hold themselves responsible to any higher authority, whether that authority be secular or religious in nature, that they largely feel that they alone are responsible for their actions, therefore can do more or less what they think is right within their own frame of reference, and do not feel that they need to be accountable for the kinds of behavior that they engage in, as long as they don't get caught at it.
They also seem to think that this is somebody else's problem, that this is act and conduct that they themselves are not very directly personally responsible to.
Yeah, one of the most disturbing things that we found in the book is the degree to which individuals have separated their own personal destinies from the destiny of those around them, in a sense that they feel their actions really don't have repercussions beyond their own lives. The fact that regardless of what happens to the group, whether that group is the community in which they live, or whether that group is something as large as the nation itself, as the United States, they feel that somehow their own personal destinies are no longer inextricably linked to that collective destiny. So they feel that whatever they do alone has little or no consequences on those around them.
Now, this seems to be across the board. We've talked about religion, but there seems to be this dichotomy almost everywhere. For example, Americans believe affirmatively, apparently, in the death penalty. 95% believe in capital punishment, and yet that's not always what we see at the polls or in the legislative process. Why the difference?
I think that the difference gets back to really the heart of what makes, in many ways, the study we undertook so different from any other. That, in a sense, that I think the tendency, what's revealed in most of these kinds of telephone polls that you get, these kind of 5-minute polls that the news media does on a variety of different kinds of issues, does not lend itself to the most kind of truthful response, because often the anonymity of the respondent isn't guaranteed. How likely, for instance, are you to admit to an interviewer who calls you up at home whether you cheat on your spouse or not? The chances are, if you're an intelligent human being, you're not likely to divulge that kind of information in those kinds of situations. So what we did in the survey was really to create a totally anonymous situation where individuals were taken off the street randomly. They had never had to reveal their identity. They were allowed to answer a variety of different questions that we asked in the total security that they had never had to divulge their identity. They filled out the questionnaire in the privacy of the research centers that we created in 50 different locations throughout the country, so that they never had to be concerned about giving the right or correct response, which is what you often get in these polls. So for like the death penalty, for instance, when you ask somebody, do you, on the abstract, support the death penalty or not, you find a much lower level than what we found in our survey when you asked them specifically, for instance, in this kind of situation, do you think the death penalty is appropriate? For instance, for an individual who's caught selling drugs to children, for instance, individuals involved in child prostitution, individuals involved in killing a police officer. When you get very specific and concrete, what we found was that about 95% of the American population say they will support the death penalty in certain situations.
Now, there are some things in here which seem to be fairly logical. I mean, we expected you to tell us that people in Beverly Hills are much more likely than the folks in the Bronx to use drugs or to have an affair. That doesn't surprise us too much. We kind of expect that from the Hollywood crowd, so to speak. But liberals are more willing to kill for their beliefs than conservatives. That is a surprise. Was your result in conducting this fraught with this type of thing, these shockers of things that you expected, and then things that were just seemed to be totally incongruous?
Yeah, I mean, I think even in the Beverly Hills, South Bronx comparison, I think we were to a great extent surprised by what we found. I mean, our hypothesis going in is that could there be one community that's above the law, and could there be another community below the law? And that's why we took really two extremes of the American experience. Those who are living in the most affluent community in the United States, Beverly Hills, and then the South Bronx, maybe the most impoverished community in this country. To some extent, by all the things that we hear about Hollywood people and what's going on in Beverly Hills, that you expected maybe a higher drug rate. But if you look at all the press coverage, drug seems to be rampant and running wild in the South Bronx community. But the reality is they seem to be just as rampant, if not more so, in Beverly Hills. We found that to be some extent a surprise. But even more surprising was the fact that there were more likely to be people carrying weapons in the Beverly Hills community than in the South Bronx. That went totally contrary to what we thought going in light of supposedly the amount of violence that plagued the South Bronx community versus the Beverly Hills. So we were surprised to find that there was actually more violence or as just much violence in Beverly Hills as in the South Bronx. So we were surprised by those kinds of findings, even in comparing those two communities. So yeah, we did find a surprise the fact that conservatives were in some sense more moral in the traditional sense their liberal counterparts.
The Day America Told the Truth by Prentice Hall Press. It has fascinating revelations, and you probably read the headlines in the newspaper that shocked America when the book first came out, but when you begin to really look through this thing, quite frankly, from my perspective, it even becomes more disturbing. For example, they point out that lying has become an integral part of American culture. And Mr. Kim, I think what shocked me was you stated we lie and don't even think about it. We lie for no reason. People we lie to most are those closest to us. And my reaction is, if the fabric of our society is torn at that level, what can we expect from our leaders? Do you think this is happening, or did your results indicate that this perfidy is the result of really a grassroots lack of conscientiousness with the truth, or are we acting this way because we perceive that our leaders and our moral arbiters in society are sending us the wrong messages?
I think there is a great deal to be said about this being really the consequences of really the loss of faith that most Americans have of the moral leadership in this country. We were absolutely shocked to find the degree to which most institutions of higher authority have eroded in legitimacy in the eyes of most people. The fact that I think our leaders across the board got anywhere from a C to a D in terms of their moral leadership, whether it was educational leaders, governmental leaders, whether it was community leaders. The fact that I think we had in one section of the book, we gave Americans an opportunity to rate the ethics of, I think, 80 or some odd different occupations, and the fact that congressmen were rated at the same level as a prostitute and a car salesman gave you some sense of degree to which people have lost faith in the political leadership in this country, as well as most other leaders. So I think there's a tremendous amount of cynicism on the part of the masses towards the so-called leaders of our society, and I think that does contribute for engaging in the kind of unethical behavior that they currently are.
Well, on page 209 of the book, you list the percentage of people who say that a source speaking to them is telling the truth, and the percentile runs from a spouse or a lover that they believe 77% of the time, and that speaks poorly of relationships. But the President of the United States only rates 32%. For crying out loud, if we can only believe the President of our country 1/3 of the time when he says my fellow Americans, are we not in very deep trouble?
Yeah, I think there is probably a great deal to be concerned about in terms of really the failure of the leadership in this country, and whether it's really possible for those leaders to have any real impact when so much of their credibility seemed to have gone out the window in the last 10, 20 years. The fact that I think we're looking at really the consequences of so many Americans having experienced the fact that they have been lied to by their elected representatives, have been lied to by the President of the United States so often, highlighted by maybe the Watergate experience right into the Iran-Contra affair, that I think is a sad reflection on our current reality, that the President of the United States is believed to be lying more often than is telling the truth according to the eyes of most Americans. And I think that does paint a rather dim picture, or it should certainly send a strong warning signal to our so-called elected officials in terms of how much of their credibility has been eroded.
Well, it's interesting, you alluded to this earlier, that people tend to be sort of making up their morals, their values, their belief system, their religion as they go along. You report that 84% of the people say they would violate the rules of their own religion. So
Yeah.
It's as if every man has become a god unto himself. Every individual has decided that external or revelatory moral codes by either a god who is there or a governmental system that issues edicts, there is really no authority outside of man himself that carries much weight in our society. And if we have everybody doing that, then a moral consensus that derives only from some subjective, internalized idea of what is right or wrong, that's a very dangerous thing. I mean, Hitler thought he was doing the right thing. Stalin thought he was doing the right thing at some level. To me, I find this very frightening that we have a real danger here of that many people totally ignoring any revelatory, objective, or transcendent or external idea of ultimate reality or truth.
Yeah, and I think that's really one of the kind of unintended consequences of really the heart of maybe the liberal paradigm, that somehow this notion that all ideas and all values are somehow equal in nature has kind of forced us, I think, into kind of almost an intellectually bankrupt position where there is a belief out there amongst most people that all positions are somehow valid, that all moral positions are open to subjective interpretation, that there is no source of external validation, there's no external source of authority which can override individual beliefs and values. And I think that does paint a rather disturbing picture about the future viability of notion of community, the notion of a state, the notion of nationhood, when there isn't really this kind of common consensus.
And yet, even though you point out that a paucity of people believe in traditional religious edicts, on the other hand, you've got 45% of the people believing in ghosts, 31% believing in magical powers, 20% believing in witchcraft. It's as if in this moral vacuum of the loss of some kind of absolutes guiding people's behavior, they conversely seem equally open to what has previously been called superstition or occult or illegitimate religion. How do you explain that?
I think that's really, in many ways, a byproduct of the fact that traditional religious institutions no longer have the kind of hold on its members that it once did. I think the fact that all of this kind of so-called New Age ethos and systems of beliefs have sprouted up over the last 10, 15 years, I think is an indication to the degree which a vacuum has been created by really the erosion and the weakening of traditional religious institutions. And as a result of that, I think people are turning to the more non-traditional sources of beliefs, faith, and I think so that's really part and parcel, part of the same process.
What did this do for your own system of religious values and beliefs as you walk through this, as you begin to see how your fellow Americans are acting, and you begin to examine your own? I'm not asking you to be personal here unless you care to be, but how did it affect you? Which direction did it tilt you, or did it have any effect on you to make you look at your own roots of beliefs and ethics?
I think it had at least for me personally, had a very profound influence on my own beliefs. That I think, having been brought up largely in an educational system and environment which was highly secular in nature, much of my education was really influenced by much of the kind of social change that impacted all our universities in the late 1960s. It was a highly critical training in a sense of questioning the legitimacy of the established institutions, questioning the legitimacy of the way society was organized, questioning the structure of leadership, questioning the dominant ethos. So it was a very kind of critical training. So I was brought up in a largely environment in which most of my education evolved around questioning the status quo and in the institutions who represented that. And as a result of that education, there were very often ever asked, despite my I would hate to admit that my long years of not trying to grow up and stay in academia, what I found was that despite all of that time, very little time was spent on addressing the question of how we ought to live our lives. Very little time was spent on probing issues of faith, of morality, of ethics. So I never really gave it that much thought during most of my academic life. And I think coming out of this book, I think I had a much stronger sense of the need for us to examine these kinds of issues, the need for indeed faith, the need for indeed, on our part, the need to ask for collectively the issue of how we ought to live our lives, which I think is at the heart of all ethical education, at least that I received growing up, despite all the strength of that kind of critical education, which I think had some very valuable things to teach. I think I've become, in that sense, probably much more conservative coming out of this exercise, that that unless we really seriously address these tougher ethical issues, that our society, our way of life, was indeed something that is becoming increasingly problematic.
Now, what do you think are going to be the great moral crusades of which you speak? You believe that in this decade, people with this yearning desire to do the right thing will look for opportunities to make it happen. At least that's somewhat hopeful. You're suggesting all is not lost, that there are people who want to right wrongs. What are these wrongs going to be that they seek to right?
I think in the 1990s there will be a much greater focus on issues like what is the collective responsibility of the community to the individual. I think we will look at our social problems, hopefully, much more in a constructive light than maybe we've done in most of the 1980s. That we will search for, hopefully, solutions which benefit the greater community. At the same time, I think there will be a forging of consensus in terms of what to do about some of the more critical issues of our time. At the same time, I hope there is a restoration of debate regarding ethics, regarding values, I think for a long time, in most of 1960s and 70s, that somehow the arena of ethics kind of became taboo, that people were afraid to put forth strong debate and discussion in terms of ethical issues, afraid to almost touch those issues because they felt that that would mean that they concurred with those values. So I think if there is to be a moral revolution, I think a much franker discussion about people engaging in a dialogue about how we ought to live our lives, what is important to us, the importance of our institutions like family, the role of schools in that moral education.
You have some interesting things to say about the sexual lives of Americans, particularly homosexuality. Now, surely there must be a lot of people in the gay community who have considered this a homophobic response. You report that homosexuals and bisexuals are twice as likely as the average person to have multiple daily sex, and the gays are twice as likely as heterosexuals to have sex more than once a day. And the multiplicity of lovers in an age of AIDS, this is not comforting news. What conclusions have been drawn? Are the gays, is the homosexual community willing to be honest about these conclusions in terms of what seems to be quite obviously a proclivity toward more erotic activity?
Yeah, I mean, what we find in regarding, at least in terms of human sexuality, is really not as newsworthy as some of the other areas. That one area that has been very extensively probed by other researchers and scholars is in the area of human sexuality, going back as far as the Kinzer report, the Masters and Johnson's report, have shed a great deal of light in terms of homosexual behavior in this country, sexual activities among both heterosexuals as well as homosexuals, and that area has been pretty thoroughly covered. And our findings are not really all that inconsistent with most of those more established findings that have been around. In terms of the AIDS issue, I think what we do find disturbing across the board is the degree to which it probably has not impacted people's sexual habits as much as one might think, both in the homosexual community as well as in the heterosexual community.
Well, you point out 92% of sexually active people say they've had 10 or more lovers and a lifetime average of 17. Now, that's a lot of sleeping around.
Yeah, and we also find that maybe one of the most disturbing things that we find in terms of sexuality is really not so much the heterosexual community versus homosexual as much as what's happening to our very young people in this country, that what we call really the end of childhood, sexual activity taking place among the very young people. The fact that I think if you look at our young adults today, I believe our study pointed out that about 1 in 5 of them, actually 1 in 4 of young adults have lost their virginity by the time they were 13 years old. So we're talking about a level of sex taking place at a very early age, and that may be one of the most disturbing things about really the consequences of really the kind of the sexual liberation of the 1960s. Being part of the baby boom generation, we always talk about sexual mores really changing with the baby boomers coming of age in the late 1960s. I think we talked a good game, but our sexual behaviors weren't all that different from that of our parents' generation. The reality is the generation that is very different is the generation that came after us, and those young adults seem to be practicing more the kind of sexual behavior at an earlier age than probably all previous generations.
This is the end of Side 1. Please turn the cassette over at this point for the continuation of the message on Side 2.
Let's walk through some of these 10 commandments of the 90s that somewhat conclusively look at the consensus you've derived here. I will steal from those who won't really miss it. I mean, that's a perversion of Robin Hood at its worst. That's really scary. That means that 74% of the people that you're around, you got to be looking over your shoulder, because if you have something they want and they think you're not going to notice it, they're going to grab it.
Yeah, we found that the high degree to which individuals could justify almost any action in terms of their kind of own set of ethics was startling. I mean, the degree to which a worker, for instance, believed that he had the right to take things from his company, almost outright petty theft, from stealing paper clips to literally people who told us they would, bring in a truck to take away supplies from their place of work to build an addition to their house, for instance, were some of the things that kind of came up, and the justification was, somehow the company wouldn't miss it and didn't really see that as being a wrongful act.
71% do not believe that this is a kinder, gentler America. And you also say that they generally believe that we're a colder, greenier, meaner, more selfish country, and yet the juxtaposition, 91% of the people are patriotic. I find that hard to believe, and you also point out that they don't have confidence that America is a dominant economic power anymore, that we've lost out to the Japanese, etc. There's this negative perception of how bad things are, and yet you find all these people who are highly patriotic, and we saw it in the post-Persian War situation. Is this some kind of national schizophrenia that we have?
Well, I think what you're finding is the degree to which patriotism defines narrower and narrower part of our lives. Somehow the notion of going out on 4th of July and waving the American flag, or sitting on the sidelines and cheering for our troops as they go off to fight a war in the Middle East, somehow is both the necessary and the sufficient criteria for being patriotic. It is a rather narrow definition in the sense of looking at the broader arena of maybe what it means to be patriotic in terms of the notion of making sacrifices for those, let's say, who are more disadvantaged than we are, the notion of caring for the future and the well-being of our country and willing to make certain sufficient sacrifice to do that. Those kinds of things are not really done. So you have this kind of strange paradox of where 90% of Americans will tell you they're patriotic. On the other hand, they may not be willing to do or are not doing a lot of the things that one may associate with patriotism beyond simply the kind of lip service that people give to patriotism.
Is there any kind of institution that you have discovered we haven't lost faith in? Marriage, government, education, religion in the church? It seems pretty much across the board. Is there any area of society where people still cling to any semblance of confidence?
Actually, despite all the interviews I've given, I think this is the first time I've been asked that question, and now that I think about it, I think the answer is no. That I cannot think of one institution, whether it's marriage, our church, our schools, our government, which people have not lost a great deal of faith, that people think of highly of. The fact that I think of the 80 or so more occupations that we ask people to rate on ethics, including everything from the U.S. Supreme Court to the President of the United States, the fact that I think the highest grade was a B+, given to, I believe, paramedics, and that somehow that everybody from physicians on down received a relatively average or poor grade. In fact, when asked to evaluate specific institutions like education and so forth, I think the average grade was a C-. Give you some idea that no, I can't think of one institution which came out well.
Is this disaffection from the top down to the bottom up? For example, is it a basic loss of confidence and faith in ourselves as creatures of moral virtue, or is it because we apparently have lost the sense of the transcendent, the belief of the other, the God who is there, who looks down on us and expects moral actions here? Is it top down, bottom up? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think, one could certainly make the argument that the top down part of it is true, that we have lost faith in those individuals who are supposedly responsible for helping to shape and change most of these aspects of our lives. I think, secondly, in terms of our loss of faith in a transcendental being, our loss of faith in God as the moral center of our lives, I think many scholars have over the last, 100 years of scholarship point out the consequences of us moving to a much more secular society. What we hope to find was, at least within that secular context, an emergence of at least a secular God. Where's this secular humanism that everybody's talking about? And I think what we were surprised to find was the degree to which secular humanism was absent or devoid in most people's lives. A general sense of what's right, what's wrong. Those kinds of values we found to be not very strong amongst most people. So in that sense, I think that is something that's much more characteristic of the masses, and it's something not just simply coming down from top down.
I have 83-year-old parents for whom I am their major source of economic support and caretaking. I was, raised with kind of bedrock values that you look after your own, you have a sense of family and community. You just don't shunt them away somewhere to make it convenient for you. And yet, on filial piety, you discovered that a majority of us apparently do not intend to take care of our parents in their old age. I don't know how old you are, Mr. Kim, but for me, that's not a comfortable thought. I mean, I'm a long ways away from old age, but the type of values that were transmitted to me that make me have that sense of accountability to my parents who looked after me, and now I'm parenting my parents, so to speak, to think that the next generation will not do that for us paints a very harsh picture of how we feel about the sense of family.
Yeah, I think probably of all the things that we looked at in terms of the erosion of family life, in terms of our serious divorce rate, the fact that 1 in 2 of us, 1 in 2 people who get married will get divorced within a 5-year period. I think it's a startling testimony to the degree to which marriage is becoming less and less viable as an institution. But maybe the most disconcerting thing that we found, I think, some philosophers said it is that you can tell a great deal about the society, the extent to which that society is organized around taking care of both its older people and its young people. And I think the degree to which filial piety has really broken down, the fact that most of us do not feel we are responsible for taking care of the economic as well as the social needs or even basic biological needs of our parents in their old age is a very disturbing phenomena. That filial piety is not a value that even people are willing to accept on a theoretical level is somewhat disconcerting.
Now, you did not intend this book, obviously, to be a polemic with regards to raising the banner for a moral cause, but you have, at least briefly toward the end of the book, pointed out what you think are ultimately the essential problems and what some of the solutions are. But put very bluntly, the thing that you point out is there just is no significant governmental, moral, spiritual, business leadership. I mean, it seems across the board in every aspect of our community, there are no serious leaders who in the eyes of our people are kind of out there carrying the flag and asking us to follow behind. How are we going to raise up those leaders from among us, given the picture that you've painted in terms of the lack of moral fortitude?
Yeah, I mean, that poses, I think, a serious challenge for our country as we move into this decade. The fact that there is a tremendous thirst for moral leadership in this country, but everywhere we turn, we are increasingly disappointed. The fact that few are willing to rise to the occasion and stand for something beyond, the parochial interest of specific groups, beyond simply the expediency of getting the majority of the votes, and that there are few, if any, leaders out there who seem to have either the moral conviction or the courage to set out an agenda, a moral agenda, in terms of how we ought to organize this country, how we ought to prioritize our needs, how we ought to transform our schools, our healthcare system, and so forth. There seems to be nobody out there who's putting forth that kind of an agenda, and I think the first person that does that and does that effectively, will probably have a good chance of being the person that leads this country for into the year 2000. And I think that quest is something that few have taken up, if any, and I think that will really be the battle cry for, I think, if not the 92 election, certainly the 96 election, as people turn inwards in terms of fixing this country, which seems to be so badly broken.
It seems to me that educators, politicians, and religious leaders are the people that most immediately come to mind as being the ones who ought to be picking up the banner and saying, "March behind me here." Do you see, as a result of those who have read this book, any serious recognition on their part? I'd have to say the recent judiciary hearings don't seem to indicate that the political leaders are sensitized yet. What about the people in the religious community? Have some of them looked at this and said, "You're right. We've spoon-fed people spiritual pablum, and now we're reaping the whirlwind of it. Maybe we better get back to some real basics in our churches and synagogues"?
Yeah, I think you're certainly right. We've had very little, if any, response from the political community, and that's certainly reflected in what we saw in the Thomas hearings of late, and the Keating 5 trials, and all the other things that seem to be going on in Washington. All the corruption that we're finding at local governmental level, with mayors going off and serving prison terms for drug addiction and so forth. But I think from the religious community, I think the response has been absolutely enormous. That I've spoken to, I think, in the past 6 months or so, dozens, if not hundreds of pastors and various different religious groups and religious leaders. And I was very heartened by the kind of response that I got, where they absolutely agreed with the disclosures that we made in the book, and felt that it was indeed their responsibility to take on this challenge in terms of their regular forms, through their sermons, through their religious activities, that indeed that they needed to wake up and address this head on.
So play the advocate for a moment here. What is, as a result of all of this research, your conviction, belief about what needs to be done? I mean, what is it? If you were standing before an ecumenical denominational group across the board and you wanted to say, "Gentlemen, reverends, look, you've read the research. Here's the way you've got to go about starting to solve this problem."
I think I would probably start off very much the way I think I was speaking to one minister a while back, and I think he wanted to use the book for the sermon, and he led off the sermon by saying, according to this book, if it was a crime to be a Christian, there certainly isn't enough evidence here to convict anyone. And I think from that premise, I think, had I been orchestrating the sermon, I'm certainly not qualified, anywhere near qualified to do something like that. I would get the discussion focused on basic moral issues, and if it's within the confines of the church, I think, what does it mean to be a religious person within our religious community? What does it mean to be a good Christian? What does it mean to be a good Jew? What does it mean to be a good Hindu? And I think what I think, and then starting from that premise, saying, how do we let that faith permeate our lives? How does that impact our day-to-day lives, the kinds of decisions we make, kinds of husbands or wives we make? The fact that religion isn't something that is practiced simply within the confines of a church building every week or a synagogue, but it's something that should permeate our day-to-day lives.
Well, you seem to point out here in your book that the golden rule sounds nice to people, but it appears to me from your research that the golden rule is ironically self-serving. The people, it's kind of a cheap and easy way out. We have a kind of warm, fuzzy, gee, do good to other people because that's what you want them to do to you. But when it comes down to the tough moral choices, the shalt nots, that seems to me what your research indicates is where it all falls apart. People just simply do not want to abide by shalt nots, whether it's danger of hellfire or danger of the policeman at the stop sign, if you run it.
Yeah, and I think that's really the core of the issue, that I think one of the criticisms that we had initially going in and doing this project is, how can you really tackle something as ambiguous as ethics in this kind of a forum? Who are you to make those kinds of moral judgments? But the reality is we're talking about some real basic stuff here. You don't have to be a moral philosopher to kind of say, hurting other people physically, stabbing them for their money is a bad thing. The fact that stealing other people's things is not a good thing. And I think on those basic levels, basic notions of decency, civility, regardless of religious sects that you belong to, regardless of the kind of overall moral view you might have on life, I think we can have a consensus on some of those basic fundamental things. And the reality is that on those basic things, we find most people are not exercising their lives according to those kinds of things.
But did the research depress you? I mean, there's a part of this looking at this. This can be real depressing reading. It's not what you want to read necessarily before you go to sleep at night. I mean, I've read all the headlines and all the articles about the book, but boy, when I dug into it, this was not real encouraging stuff. How did you deal with that?
I think the way we dealt with it is the fact that despite the sobering nature of so many of the findings, is that it really became the basis of thousands of conversations that I've had since then. And I think each one of those conversations that it led to, I think, have been very positive and have been very heartening. I think when you get people to sit down and, for instance, take one of the tests in the book, and there's a series of these tests that kind of force you to sit down and probe moral issues, I think when people began to reflect on those issues, I don't think anybody liked the picture that they saw painted of themselves and of the country at large. That at least once this picture was painted, I don't think anybody walked away from it and saying, gee, that's real nice. I think the vast majority of the people who read the book, who saw some of the findings, concurred that is indeed a sign that things are definitely wrong and that we really do need to change our thinking and our behavior. To that extent, I think the most encouraging part of this is that despite the sobering nature of the findings, once people were exposed to it, the kinds of conversations it led to, at least for me, was very heartening, because it indicated that, one, people recognized that problem did exist, and two, there was a desire to talk about different kinds of solutions, and led to other issues that forced us to kind of confront our morality. And when we do confront it, I think most people will find that their current kinds of thoughts may be questionable and problematic.
Violence, racism, honesty, respect for institutions, among all the issues that you dealt with in here, conclusively, in a nutshell, what did you think when you synthesized it all was really the core problem that was kind of bubbling underneath the lack of moral grace in all of these areas?
I think probably underlying all of it, if there's a kind of a single explanation or a thought, is the one I believe, which at least certainly played a major contributory role in looking at all the things that's happening in all our different facets of life, is that this kind of intrinsic belief that has been kind of disseminated to most of the population in the last 20 or 30 years, this notion that morality has, or ethics has, no real play in our everyday life. That somehow a fundamental belief that every opinion is valid. Somehow the belief that every choice is equal to other choices. The fact that as a community that we do not have to have a kind of a common set of values, if not common, at least a quest for a common set of values. The fact that that quest seems to be not as strong as it once was, for me, I think probably the primary reason for what you're seeing as this kind of general erosion of morality across the board, and that we do need to return to kind of some basic sense of who we are, basic notions of community and family, basic notion of decency, civility. In many ways, the fact that we've kind of gotten away from that seems to me at the kind of the root of the problem.
The Day America Told the Truth, Prentice Hall Press. Peter Kim, the co-author of the book, has had a very fascinating discussion, and I thank you very, very much for taking your time to walk us through what is in the underbelly of America. It is in many ways not a very pleasant picture. We can't be happy of the way in which we see ourselves. Hopefully you have contributed through your incisive analysis something that will make us pick ourselves up by our moral bootstraps and look to a God who is there that might have something to say about how we ought to live as better people. And I thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thank you.
This is the end of the message. For further information regarding other topics available on cassette and in printed form, write Compassion Connection, Box 36C, Denver, Colorado, 80236.